Okay, in this specific case, we're talking about a candidate who is hoping to interview for a senior level IC software development engineer role. This candidate definitely has a background with several top tier firms on their resume, lots of conference participation, and a focus on networking and security in their background. And so a lot of the questions that are going to be asked are focused around their abilities as a software engineer, not tech questions, but more around situational questions, how they did, what they did, why they were thinking what they were thinking, why they did what they did, to really test their ability to do the job without necessarily diving into the specific technical questions which tend to get asked in some software development manager interviews. Oftentimes, as a software engineer, you're left to make decisions about how to implement features based on requirements that are sometimes really well written and maybe sometimes a little bit vague. And that can make the job very, very difficult. One of the things that you really want to see in a software engineer is that when they make those decisions, they tend to be right a lot. There's nothing worse than having to go back and rewrite a bunch of code because as a team, the engineers went through some one-way doors, didn't understand that they were going through one-way doors, and then you have to unwind a bunch of stuff, or maybe they didn't architect things correctly because they didn't think things all the way through, and now you've got a lot of technical debt that's going to weigh down the product over time or weigh down the ability to deliver feature updates over time. And so in this specific case, what we're looking for is whether or not the candidate as a software engineer has demonstrated that they are right a lot.
Give me an example of a time when you had to make an important decision, design decision, coding decision, whatever, in the absence of good data, right? You just didn't have all the data you would have liked to have had, but you had to make a decision under a tight time constraint, something like that. Walk me through it.
Does it have to be a technical decision?
No.
No? Okay.
Nope.
So at the beginning of that, obviously going into a startup or considering going into a startup with just like a few other people is a big life decision because I'm committing to all this time and working with these people for who knows how long. And going in, the only person I knew on the team was my friend from high school and college. But there was the CEO and the attorney that they had. I guess he was the general counsel, who were also on the team who I didn't know. So there was unknown there of the most of the team, whether or not whether or not we could bring a product to market. And I guess the unknown of how much work was ahead of us. But I think based on the opportunity that I saw and the potential market size, I made the decision to join that startup, and we definitely learned a lot along the way. And then at the same time, near the end of when David and I were working on the startup, we had at that point asked to get in front of customers several times for feedback, and that had never materialized. So we didn't really have information at that time, like when we could get realistic feedback from customers, or when what the, I guess, plan was for us to go to market. So yeah, there was still potential there. The idea's potential is still there today. But based on our information at the time, we had to say we've put over a year of work into this, and yeah, we could keep going, and we don't know what will happen if we do. aside from more time being invested in this. But based on our current the current behaviors we've seen, I think that we think it's time to cut loose on this.
So how and why was the CEO blocking you? I guess I'm not understanding that. How he was preventing you from talking to customers, or even why?
So his role was that he had the connections in the oil industry for customers who would have been, or for potential customers of this product.
Mhm.
And he was also acting as the product owner and saying, we need these additional features before we get in front of customers. And it was kind of a cycle of that. He kept scope creeping because of his desires to have the product perfect before we got in front of customers.
So you think he was operating from a place of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good?
I believe so. Either that or incompetence. I'm not sure.
And so at any time did you try to go, obviously it's a small company, so go around is a bit of a strong statement, but did you ever try to get in front of customers on your own?
Yes, so one of my other high school friends is a landman. The role that this would seek, this
What
product
is the name of the role?
landman.
Okay.
That's the job that this
Yep.
was seeking to automate. So we
I'm
did get
assuming you grew up in Texas. If you went to A&M and you're talking about oil and gas, you have a friend who's a landman. Okay.
exactly.
I used to live in the Woodlands, so I down outside of Houston, so I was well acquainted with mineral rights and all the other things.
Anadarko and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we actually did get on a conference call with him and showed him our MVP, and he validated the direction we're going, and he was lined up to be I forget what they call it, like kind of like an agency where they have a bunch of landmen and contract out to oil companies. He was going to, whenever we were comfortable, get a meeting with his agency to kind of demo it to them. But our CEO kind of like put the brakes on that.
Why and how?
Just because he was nervous about, I think, the state of the product. And I think in I don't know how that would have gone if we would have gone ahead, because like him and the general counsel had a majority ownership of the company.
So there was a lot to like in this answer, but some misses for the candidate and something in terms of the feedback that was given to the candidate in our follow-on session that they need to think about when they're delivering their answers. This specific question was targeting design decisions, how they build software, how they build product, and that really wasn't touched on in their answer. It wasn't even clear what their difficult decision was in terms of what they presented, whether it was to leave the company they were at or whether to join the startup where they were at. And so that was somewhat challenging as far as answers given. I would say that the answer did demonstrate very clearly a high degree of customer ownership and bias for action. What was really great about what came through here is, this candidate, their background was largely in larger companies, and in this case, they were giving an example where they were at a startup. They decided to try something, shoot their shot, and they realized that they were being blocked by their CEO from being able to make good decisions about the product. They weren't really didn't have the ability to have access to customers, and so they took it upon themselves to figure out a way to get access to customers. So that's bias for action, as well as really trying to understand the customer problems that they were trying to solve and whether or not what they had built was good enough. And so in that regard, they did a really, really good job in communicating that. Unfortunately, the answer itself broadly, in terms of good decision, bad decision, and how do you know or not, it just wasn't clear what the decision was. And that would have been fine if the answer was rooted maybe in a software design problem, but in this case, it was super unclear how it would relate back to how they would do their job. So it muddled it up a bit. But I would say that overall, though, I came away from this with a pretty good understanding of this candidate's ability to kind of step out of the large company role and into a smaller company role. And so depending on who they were interviewing with, that's actually pretty important, right? So some problems that you might have when coming from a big company going to a smaller company is, do you know how to operate in a faster paced environment or in a resource constrained environment, or where you're being asked to do a bunch of different things that maybe aren't your job, right? So that's being able to demonstrate ownership and kind of jump up and do things that maybe aren't your responsibility. So lots to like in this answer. Unfortunately, didn't answer the specific question I asked, but that's okay in this case. I thought the candidate did a great job. So how did this candidate do with regards to our write a lot? Well, let's have a look at the feedback that would have been read into the room for the candidate debrief. Candidate did not adequately answer the question as asked in terms of specificity relating to the decisions made. There was no doubt a lack of information relating to both joining and leaving the startup was at play. It's a small nit, but an important one for the candidate to understand, as they need to ensure that they are not only answering the question, but communicating their answer clearly without leaving the interpretation open to subjectivity on the part of the interviewer. If we use the decision to leave as the one that was intended, this was in fact a tough decision with imperfect information. What's not clear is whether or not this was the right decision. It's clear from the description of the CEO that there was likely systemic issues that were unlikely to be resolved in the short term. This is an opportunity for the candidate to be more specific in the answer that they gave to ensure that both the lack of information was clear, the decision that was made was clear, as well as whether or not the decision was right.